question or comment?
Hi, it's Matt. Can you hear me first?
Yeah, it's a wee bit robotic, but we can hear you. We can hear you.
Firstly, my apologies for coming in late. I was just in the door. I'm actually coming from this from different angles. One, I'm an ex-SNP councillor who's had to deal with the questions on how do we deal with care kids in different areas. And the other side of me for that, so I can hear myself, is I myself personally is not long out of a relationship from someone who has lived in the care system. And I got a lot of things told about me by that person, exactly what it was like in the care system. Jane, probably she spoke to you and when you said all these forums and things. Some of the things that came up that I heard from her and from other people that came to the council to speak to us, very similar to what Jane said. But reading between the lines from what I noticed was the actual system itself didn't work. It's not working at all. Gordon touched on a bit there with companies for the finances and things like that. There's lots and lots of finances being literally ripped out the system and going to the wrong places. And one of the things that came up through my conversations was the money that the care kids get given on a daily basis. What I was informed was £60 a day that they were getting given. No budgeting skills given to them on how to deal with that. So they got it in their head on how they dealt with things, and when they left the care system, they weren't getting £60 a day. They didn't realise that they had to earn that money when they got out. And the other element that drains money for councils is the fact that they're taking the kids from an area, say they're taking it from the area that I live in Inverness, they're taking them from there and they're putting them in Fife, in the care homes down there. Even though there's orders in place for the children to visit their families at weekends or on a daily basis, they can go and visit their families in some cases. It's a total restructure that actually needs done on this, because the councils are draining their money by even paying taxi fares so that kids can go from Fort William to go to a school in Inverness, when they could actually put the child in a care home or a care family within Inverness, or put them in a school in Fort William if that's where they are. And this never ever comes up through any of the conversations that the councillors have. Councillors never think about asking this question on, do we put them in that area in a school? And I think that's down to the fact that they don't have enough information on it. And certainly, yes, some things I've certainly noticed is even seeing things in the press, kids being taken off their families when there's actually no need for it to be taken off them. I've got a family that lives around the corner from me. Their son was taken off them. The other children were left in the family home. Their son was taken off them because he was too skinny. And it actually turned out that he had a medical condition because he was the reason why he was skinny. I suppose it's not really a question as such, it's more a point to put across for everyone. It would be interesting to know how, in a policy way that I'm trying to think in my head, how would we then, if any Alba personnel got elected on the councils or even in Parliament, how do we word a policy or a law or bylaw to stop these bigger companies from draining the money from governments?
Thank you, Alan. Does anybody want to take it first? Maggie, I'll come to you first if you want to have a wee response to that, and then we'll just go around the rest of the panel.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say the first thing we want to do is to stop families being broken and stop breaking up families. And I completely agree with you that, I mean, in my experience, a lot of these children don't need to be in care. They should not be in care. They should be supported. And, you know, I think relationships are important, but a primary relationship of a child is with their mother. Now, we are taking infants away from young mothers who've been in care, and they're being given a bus fare from the hospital to go home. I mean, I can't think of anything crueler to do than to tell a mother while she's pregnant, you're going to take her child off her when it's born, and do that, and actually do that, knowing, and that child will not go to a happy ever after home. You know, that child will be an average of 3 years in the care system, being, even if they're with one carer, they'll be going to respite carers, they'll be being, as you've said, you know, moved about between foster homes or between going to see their parents. And I've heard of parents who've had children removed at birth having to actually see that newborn child in a cafe in a garden centre, in Dobie's garden centre. That's where they saw their child after having last seen it in hospital and it's taken away. So we're doing this to families, and then we wonder, and then people are actually making money out of that. And there's no stopping it, because, as I told you, that if you don't have resources to, if maybe even a very simple thing would be to give social work teams a budget and to say to them, here's this budget. Now it's £1,000 to take a child into care at minimum, and sometimes 4,000, 5,000. Build up your services on the ground, build what families need, get home helps and family care and family assistance and after school clubs and weekend clubs and refuges where children can go if there's trouble in the family. So I do think local and putting the money where the need is and the decisions where the need is. And I think that's what, you know, would be a good argument to make in, you know, in council chambers. Let's start looking at devolving budgets, taking that money and moving it into this. Now, there might be some double counting at first, but I think if you got parents behind the wheel as well, asking them, involve them in decision making, ask parents what would have helped, what they need, how would you, and actually go through all those children and say, why is that child not at home? Why is that child not at home? What does that mother need to get that child home? What is it that family needs? What about a gran? What about an auntie? What do they need? Let's do that and get that child out of care. And I mean, I think our charity, PAR, we do get children out of care. And when you think what we are saving councils, if we got 50% of what we saved, we could then be working, or somebody could be working to build up the kind of services that would stop other children coming into care, and have support offered to mothers by other mothers who've been through it, or by grannies who've got, you know, more experience and more, you know, stability. So I think I'd always say go local, devolve the budgets down, and suck the taxes up, you know, like take the taxes locally as well. Everything closer to people.
Thanks, Maggie. Jane, do you want to come back on that?
Yes, I just wanted to comment about, you know, one of the, well, over and over again at the forum, we heard about people telling us they recalled being in the family home, and they recalled the process of being taken away. And one person, we actually quoted him in the report because it really resonated with a lot of what we'd heard from other people, was that he had witnessed as a child his mother being social worked to death, was what he said. And that was so disempowering for her, to the point where everything she was doing well as a mother, all of the good skills, all of the things she was getting right for her family were undermined and eroded to the point where she just wasn't coping and the children were taken away. So in our recommendations, because that was one of the things we heard over and over about families being disempowered and that lack of support, we've placed emphasis, or we've said that one of the, you know, in the recommendation, emphasis needs to be placed on not the problems, not the things that are not working, but actually on things that are working in the family, where the children are being cared for, they are being nurtured, and use that as the basis to build on the things that then aren't, and put the resources around around the mother, around the family, to be able to make the changes that are necessary for everyone to thrive.
Thanks, Jane. Gordon?
Yeah, on the point about what you would do to sort of change the law or exclude businesses, I think you have to be fairly pragmatic and realize that you can't do it overnight, and you will, even if you don't want to, you'll end up having to work with people. I mean, in my tax career, I don't think I have ever made a tax settlement, either as an inspector or as an accountant, that had very much to do with what the law actually said. Everybody just agreed to do a deal to settle things. And I would approach this in the same kind of way. When I was on the Policy Development Committee, I did a paper on something, on reforming audit, because audits these days are not really worth anything at all. The audit regulations really need changed. But one of the points that I made was that if we were going to do that, the smart way to do it was to approach the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Scotland and kind of flatter them because they are the oldest institute, and kind of get them on board, knowing that you wouldn't get everything you wanted, but it was better to have them cooperating. And I would try and do simple things like capping the amounts that the local authority is allowed to pay for various things, or the capping the number of agency staff, say, they're allowed to use, but doing it on the basis that, you know, it's not an instant change. It'll take place over various years, and then just trying to talk to the companies and the professional associations to negotiate something better than you've got now, even if it's not ideal.
Thanks, Gordon. Alan, is there anything you want to come back on anything that the panel said there?
Yeah, just listen to that last one, to be honest. It's more, I get what you're saying. I absolutely agree that it's very hard for us to do something like that. I was just scribbling down what I would want to ask. You would have dealt with a lot of things as your tax inspector days and your stuff around that, the financial side of things. There's places that are charities, but they're not for profit. Like Combat Stress is one of the places they're not allowed to make a profit. They can have a little buffer in their pockets, so they can fall back on something, but they're not allowed a massive amount. I'm just wondering if there's maybe a way that we can think of a policy that if someone is a care provider, that they are classed as a not-for-profit organisation that does that, then that would certainly stop the dripping of all the cash that's going to shareholders and things like that.
Gordon, I'll give you the chance.
I think that's actually quite a good idea. I mean, if you do that and you introduce it incrementally, you're not necessarily going to cut the earnings of the people who are doing the work, but you will, yeah, stop money going out unnecessarily. Yeah, I think it's worth. It's not the sort of thing you can just. Yeah, that's a great idea, but that's a good place to start.
Thanks, Gordon. Right, I think we've exhausted that with Alan. As long as you're okay with that, Alan, we'll invite the next speaker, who is Lucy from Parents Across Scotland. I'll just add you onto the menu, and I'll remove Alan from. Just whenever you're ready, Lucy.
Thanks, Peter. I think a lot of mine has kind of been answered, but I suppose just taking it back to the bringing it into local level, bringing it back down to families and building relationships. And I was just wondering if we're trying to target children as early on as possible, what kind of things can we be doing to get early intervention? Do we need to be getting into schools more? Do we need to be focusing on like in the communities more? What exactly is it we need to be doing to get that early intervention targeted? Do we need to be getting supports in schools where we're raising awareness about ACEs, about adverse experiences? Do we need to be getting it back in at that level, because it's kind of taken away from that at the moment? That we've got like increased need for it but reduced capacity to do it. So how do we focus on it? And I was just wondering as well about, when you're talking, Maggie, about the sort of like mums and parents being the central point of a child's life, and to try and stop the removal from the family, should we be focusing more on kinship care and trying to keep the support within families? Is there anything more that could be getting done round about that area to try and build that up? Because when we're talking about like foster care and the amount of money that goes in, I mean, kinship carers absolutely struggle. They're barely given anything to try and keep their children within their family. They're just kind of left to deal with it a lot of the time on their own, and it feels just really unfair that there's a potential avenue there to stop a child being removed from their family, and it's not being utilised quite as much as what it could be. And I worked in secure care with teenagers, and there was one of the things that stuck with me that a girl said to me, and actually, and sadly, she recently died just about a month and a half ago. She was 23 at this point, and we'd stayed in touch throughout like the time that she'd come out, and she did struggle, but she said that she wanted, I kind of teared up when I say this bit, but she wanted social work to lay down her coffin for her so they could let her down one last time. And I think we've got to really think about the fact that these are children's lives, and how do we get back to the central point of making sure that they're not left in this position? What can we do? What can our counsellors do, like to get us back to that? Because I completely agree with the taking it local. I live in Inverclyde. It's one of the worst areas in Scotland. It's deprived. It's got the least amount of funds. How can the children in Inverclyde be protected when we've got absolutely nothing? What do we do? I know it's a big open-ended question, but
So we'll come to Maggie first of all, and see if you've got a response, Maggie.
I always say the same thing. I think support families and don't intervene directly into. I think children have had too much intervention, if you like, or over families' heads or behind. You can't go over somebody's head to try and operate on their child to come up to some standards of, well, the Byres Road strata, of what they think should happen. Children are best within their own families. There's very few families that are so, very, very few families that are so dangerous. Now, kinship care is used, but actually you are going to become, a friend of mine who's a carer for two children who are not related to her at all. And she has gone from a well-paid career woman. She's now single, widowed, in fact, and she's gone from that to poverty. She has the kinship care allowances, but she has to live on incomes. But she couldn't work because one of the children has got special needs. So that's immediately happens to women who become kinship carers. They have to give up they can be grannies that are only 45 or something. They have to give up a job that they've maybe just got into in a career they've got, or a job with a bit of a pension, and they've got to give that up to look after very young children. And it really is huge poverty trap. So anyway, that's a bit of a by the way, but I do think support families, that's where the attention should go. What is it like if we were actually really listening and attentive to what the mothers of and the fathers and other family members of the children that turn up in school hungry, badly dressed, not got coats, if we were listening to them about where the troubles and stresses in their life. One thing that's not come up is domestic violence and abuse of women, and it's one of the reasons, other than sheer poverty, that women have their children removed, because women get blamed for being hit and for the harm that comes, because it's called emotional abuse of children to see their mother being hit. I mean, but then the mother gets the blame. The children are, taken to hearings or removed because they've witnessed violence, and the mother gets the blame. So we're a deeply mother blaming, women blaming system, the care system. Women have got all the responsibility to keep families healthy and safe, and mothers take all that responsibility. They get no support or help for doing it, and social work just adds a layer of blame, really. I mean, people would just say, I mean, when I gave up local authority social work, it was when I realized if a social worker came to my door to say they had been, somebody had phoned them up or they had some concerns about my children, I would shut the door and call a lawyer, because you know, you just think that's what was happening to families is just not right. So I think we need to support families. So I was at a really good meeting the other week where somebody, Polly Curtis, she's written a book about the care system, but she's, and I agree with this, that social work should be all about supporting families, and there should be very tiny number of social workers working with the police to look at child abuse, and that's like actual child abuse, sexual abuse and physical abuse of children, not neglect, which is actually just confused with poverty, and people are drawn into care because of poverty. So I think we should, in that way, that's something you could turn around without too much trouble, if you like. But you need some of the services need a brain implant to change the way of thinking about what they're doing. It should be about love, care, concern, empathy, humanity, building up families, and not kind of picking them apart. So
Thanks, Maggie. Jane?
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to what's already been said from certainly from my professional life, but if, on a personal note, when I'm thinking about my own experiences as a parent, I mean, my boys are 21 and 18 now, but I have a friend who's a health visitor and still very much involved in caring for women and families in the community. But it made me think about early intervention and what that would mean. And it actually, when people were talking there, it made me think about the stigma of having to say, actually, I'm not coping with this newborn baby, or I've got 3 kids under 5, and you know, I don't know where to turn, and I live up a close and I can't be bothered bumping the buggy down, and I've got nobody to go and meet to go for coffee. There's a whole stigma associated to that. So it's very hard for families to ask for help in the early, you know, if we're looking at early intervention, because you're supposed to be having the time of your life and loving, you know, your kids, and it's all great and they're well turned out, and you know, to put your hands up and say, oh, actually, you know, when my 2 were wee and they were at home and I wasn't at work, that was a nightmare of a time. Who would, you know, it would have been okay for me to say that to my friends. It's not okay if you're living in poverty to say that. So that's just a personal thing. People were talking there, and look at how that's changed over the years, because you know, I think there's been improvements made in sort of antenatal care, but then you only get your midwife up until day 10, and then you only get the health visitor up until 6 weeks, and then you're pretty much on your own.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jane. Gordon?
I don't really have much to say on that, because the kind of professional side of this is not my speciality. But on a slightly a personal note, I do wonder sometimes about gathering information, because my son used to play Sunday league football, and there was a boy who played in his team, and he was really polite. He was a very pleasant boy. He was a good footballer. There was never any trouble with the coaches. He was friendly with parents. But at school, he was constantly being excluded. He was eventually sort of completely excluded from any possible school. And I mean, I don't know very much about what happened. My son still has some contact with him. I know that he's been in jail since he left school. And I just feel that somebody should have been able to do something, and nobody ever came round and spoke to anybody in the football club, or as far as I know, tried to work out why there was this big behavioural difference between the boy we saw and the boy the school saw. But I have no idea how you'd actually go about doing that.
Sometimes that can be as simple as the child being dyslexic and actually quite bright, but my son's friend at school, it turned out exactly that. And he actually told my son that he set out to destroy any teacher that he came across, because he had to beat the teacher because the teacher would expose him for not being able to read properly. So when it came to any attention on him, he would just be really, really naughty and really bad or really sassy or whatever. And he's all right now, but he went through a really troubled time. And it was dyslexia in the family. And if somebody'd inquired, one of the brightest kids I ever came across, really bright. I taught him to play chess and he beat me in the first game because I wasn't expecting it. And that's how, so I think it's for a kid like that, it might be something as simple as that somebody's not worked that out. And like you say, it would be an easy inquiry to make, but the kids get kind of pigeonholed, you're the bad one, and they can never do good for doing bad,
Lucy, is there anything you want to come back on there?
Just on that point Maggie made there, just quickly, I also worked with a young, he was about 15, Maggie, and it was in a high school, and we took a senior phase class for him and a couple of others to try and target softer skills for him, because he was so severely dyslexic. It hadn't been picked up through primary school. I think it was maybe about third or fourth year before it actually started to get identified, and by this point he was already having referrals made against him. He was on the sort of pathway that they were saying, right, there's something going to happen here. And if it really took to just these softer skills classes, and I think maybe more of that being incorporated into education as well could certainly help pick up on the signs that are being displayed by these children who are not putting out what they're being expected to put out in their academic classes, and it would maybe just kind of catch that gap just a little bit. But that was me, thank you.
Welcome, Lucy. Anybody want to come back on anything Lucy said there before we invite the next question? No, everybody's happy with that. Okay, so Jimmy Ross next. I'll just pin you to the menu.
Hi.
On you go, Jimmy, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, 2 seconds. I'm coming from a different side of this. To put you in the picture, I was the police child protection officer for over 7 years, where I had to vote at case conferences to put children on the risk register, and also, unfortunately, to put children into care. Now, I've heard a lot of people here say there is a tiny majority of children that can't be left in a home situation. Sorry.
Nice timing, Jimmy.
That can't be left in a home situation. And it's a very difficult decision to make. And quite often, the thing that I notice, it's maybe one abusive parent or relative. And we should be excluding the abusive parent or relative and keeping the children in the home. We have a thing called exclusion orders in Scotland, and we've had them for many years, but they're never utilised to the extent they should be. So even though, whether we like it or not, some children need to be taken in to care for their protection, we should try and exclude the abuser or the alleged abuser and keep the children in the home. You know, kinship care, someone mentioned, I think Parents Across Scotland, you know, that would be a perfect solution for many kids. You know, I think we have to find a solution for children who are abused and somehow or other keep them with the non-abuse. Very few times you'll get two abusive parents, especially for sexual abuse of children. That's very rare. It's even quite rare, to be quite honest, for physical abuse of children. And someone else mentioned domestic abuse there. Certainly in my experience, we tried everything to exclude the abuser rather than exclude the child. But I would like to say that in my experience, working with social workers and everything, taking children into care was always the last resort, with the exception possibly of no one seemed to want to push using exclusion orders. They seemed to be too difficult to get and to implement. I don't know if anybody agrees with the use of exclusion orders rather than taking children out of the home.
Thanks, Jimmy. I'll come to Jane first this time. Jane, is there anything you'd like to comment on from what Jimmy said there?
Yeah, when Jimmy was speaking, it was actually reminding me of a job I used to have years ago when I worked in women's aid, and we were aware of the exclusion orders, and that was something that we'd kind of campaigned for, and that was about 20 years ago when I worked there. And my understanding is now there's a sort of kind of local MARAC that meets with police and social work and whatever each week that discuss any domestic abuse cases, so that is looked at. I think one of the points I just wanted to make is when I was looking at the most recent figures for the number of children who are in care in Scotland today, it's 14,500. And the figures went up last year for the first time in about 7 years after being static. So there's an increase actually in the number of children being taken into care. And I think out of that 14,500 children, 10% of them are in institutions. And certainly the forum heard, it was like 2/3 of the people we heard from different institutions, 2/3 of them were from children's homes. So to me, that 1,500 children in institutional care is unacceptable, and certainly 14,500 in care. I have to say though, that figure does include kinship care from what I know, and I don't know off the top of my head what proportion of that, if we weren't counting that as being in care, but I still think it's far too high, and the fact that it's beginning to creep up is concerning.
Thanks, Jane. Gordon?
No, sorry. I don't think I can really comment on any of that.
Okay, thank you. Maggie?
I don't actually have much experience of using of them being used, exclusion orders, and they would be helpful. I suppose it might be something to do with, it's usually the man and it's usually his home, and there's probably a reluctance to use an order to exclude him, and I don't really know about that. I'm trying to remember what else it was. I did think, I will comment on something else that you said, but I haven't got a pen handy and I didn't write it down, but it'll maybe come back to me.
Okay, thanks, Maggie. Jim, is there anything you would like to come back on? Anything?
No, I just thought I'd like it. It's a terrible decision to make to take a children into care. Mm-hmm. And certainly in my experience, the social workers I worked with, it was the very last resort. And I think, to be quite honest, and many people have touched on it here, they played safe because of lack of resources. They didn't have the resource to properly supervise a children left in a home. So the simple way was take them into care. Whether we like it, we see in the press, all these children are left in the home and then suddenly they're murdered, and then who gets the blame? Usually the social work department. Yeah. So
yeah, I think
you have the social workers taking the fail-safe approach, which is totally understandable.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely true. And I think that social workers almost in local authorities almost begin to see the family as the enemy or a really dangerous thing for them. That might be the family that will be your downfall. You will be in the newspapers because you didn't remove that child or whatever. I mean, actually, child homicide is rare. It does. I don't know if it increased over lockdown because there seems to have been some horrific cases, but I don't know if that actually has or hasn't, but it mainly for years stayed very, very steady. So it's not like it's happening all the time, or it's a big risk. People overestimate the risk of it happening and they underestimate the risks of care, because children do get abused in care, as Jane was saying, you know, the testimony of children afterwards and not being listened to. And I mean, I've been at recent meetings where, you know, a child's complaint about being abused was just scoffed at. And also the staff saying how hurtful it was, how hurt they were. And was I actually accusing them of something? And all I'd said was, well, have you got any evidence that that this is not true? And that was seen as being just, you know, beyond, like, just shocking and horrible. And I'm still actually quite upset about it. So, and wondering how am I going to tackle all that? But that seems to be the prevailing thing of a total defensive system, even though every day in the newspapers you can see reports of abuse, you know, in this home, that residential school, that school. And it's in the papers every day, and yet why do we think it's not happening now? Why would we think it's all finished? It all happened in history and it doesn't happen now. And people just find it really hard to believe. And I think that's so there's a real an imbalance of understanding of risk going on there, that risk is all seen as being in the family and not in care. Or when children are separated from, we know it, and you know, when the US take these children off their parents at the border with Mexico, we know that those children are being taken into peril. We know that that's a terrible thing to do, and yet we do it, thinking that when we do it, it's kind.
Yeah. Jimmy, thank you very much for your question. I'm going to now invite Jeanette in to ask her question. I'll just pin you on. And we'll remove Jimmy. Just whenever you're ready then, Jeanette.
Hello there. I haven't really got any questions as such, but I kind of wanted to come in and talk to you about being a kinship carer, which I am for two of my grandchildren. And when you were talking about moving down to the poverty line, that is very, very true. I had to give up a job to take my two grandchildren who are both on the autistic spectrum. I can't work. I've got to be on hand for the children. But the solution to that was to go on universal credits. Now, I'm 62 almost, and I've worked since I was 16-year-old, brought my two girls up and worked all through bringing them up as well. And for to be on universal credits is a bloody disgrace. Before I was a kinship carer, I was a foster carer as well. 2016, I became a foster carer for an agency, the National Fostering Agency. And I had a wee boy who I had for almost 4 years, not on a permanent basis. It was only short term to start with, but because the wee boy had lots of complex needs, this was the place that he settled. We had our ups and downs, and it was an absolute roller coaster of a ride. Not well paid. I wouldn't say I was well paid for it. Because it was an agency, the local authority paid the agency, and I got a cut off of that. But I found out since then that the agency were actually earning more than I was earning. Not that I was doing it for the money, that's certainly not what I was doing it for, or I wouldn't have been doing it, to be quite honest with you. But that wee boy had, when I became a kinship carer, instead of giving me a bigger house, they took the wee boy away and put him in a place that wasn't suitable for him, and I kicked and I screamed and I shouted. They did not listen. That was Clark's Council. The wee boy was placed, the placement broke down before the year was up, he was put into another place. That broke down. He's now in residential care. I could have still had that wee boy if I had been listened to, but they didn't listen. We're not listened to as parents. We're not listened to as carers either. And that's all I've got to say.
Thanks very much, Jeanette. Jane, I'll come to you first, if there's anything you want to say there. And that. First of all, can I say, Jeanette, thanks very much for doing what you do, especially having to give up your job and continuing to care for people in such a short amount.
I wouldn't have it any other way. I wouldn't have it any other way. My children, I couldn't have been a foster carer and had my grandchildren going into care. And I mean, I class myself as a good foster carer and a good kinship carer, a good granny, or nana as I'm called. And I know there are good carers out there. And I know that the residential home that the wee boy that I fostered is a good residential home, because I know a few of the people that are there. I'm still in touch with the wee boy. I still go and see him and got contact and things with him. So that is good in that respect, that's never been stopped, because I always told that wee boy that I would be here. I would never go away.
But it is heartbreaking to think that, I mean, how child-centred is that? That instead of giving you a salary and letting you, and a bigger house or the ability, you know, and just letting you get on with doing what you were doing, he gets moved. You know, like I said, you know, he's a commodity, he's in the system, he gets moved. I've seen that so often, not listening to parents, not listening to the foster carers, and not letting the parents and foster carer just actually make a good relationship and do things in the best interest of the children. There's always this, yeah, and you could write some of these children's stories. The minute you said that, I thought, that wee boy, if he's not in residential care now, he will be, because that's just, you could write the story. So
that wee boy screamed on his way to that residential home that he wanted to come back to Jeanette. And he could have come back here in a heartbeat.
Yeah, and they still wouldn't let him. I know. I had a boy like that, and yeah, exactly that. Just horrendous. And that foster mother, the foster mother was told to tell him it was fine and he was to go, because they were moving him from a loving foster home where he was happy. But the foster father just wouldn't do it. He said, I'm not going to tell the child a lie. I'm not going to say it's going to be good or it's great. But it was hard. It's heartbreaking. So I feel for you. I feel for you.
Jane, you want to come back on there?
No, I don't have anything to add. I just want to say hats off to you, Jeanette. I think you're remarkable, and thanks so much for sharing that with us. I'm pretty sure that would have taken out of you, and it's really contributed something really valuable to the discussion. Thank you.
Absolutely. Gordon's there.
Lots of the systems need to change. The education system needs to change. They need to listen to us as carers and mothers, grandmothers. I mean, I fought with the school for my daughter who was dyslexic. I fought for primary 2 to 3 to tell them, no, there's something wrong. Primary 7, she eventually got assessed by an educational psychologist that she had dyslexia. I told them away back in primary 2 because I had got her privately assessed. I knew the wee boy I fostered. I knew there was something with him. I had to fight again. Education. I'm still fighting education with my grandchildren.
Yeah, I think for me, it's like the difference between being viewed as the problem and viewed as the solution. And that absolutely needs to shift, because people who know the children have the answers, and that's where, go back to what Maggie was saying earlier about involving people around that family unit or in the community. That's, those are where the solutions lie, not in this system.
No.
Yeah, and actually that was me, because I do think what I was saying earlier about, because I think foster carers, parents and people in communities have got the solutions, not just for that family, but collectively, if you imagine. And I suppose the other idea I might throw in though is cooperatives, that if instead of these private companies, what about cooperatives of carers? Like if you were with a cooperative of 5 or 6 or 10 other carers in your area in Clackmannanshire, you'd have power, you know, you'd be a collective group, you'd be able to bargain with the council and say, we want, and tell them how you want to be dealt with, how you want things to go, what your conditions are. And then, and if you had a surplus from the income, that instead of going to a private foster care dividend, you could be using that to be setting up the kind of services you need. So I do think things like I think the solutions are in communities. They're in you know, people like you in your situation. This in every community, the solution is there. And maybe cooperatives might be, I don't know whether Gordon's got something to say about cooperatives, but I think they're a very good, or they can be a really good model.
Gordon?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, that whole story is fairly harrowing, and on the kind of main point, I don't have a lot to say, but I was interested on just the comment that the agency were getting more than you, and that happens a lot. Even when the agency isn't getting more, I'm aware of an umbrella company that supplies agency staff to councils, and they make about 90,000 a year roughly from one of the staff they supply, but they don't pay staff any more than about 60,000 maximum. So they're taking a third of the money is just going to their profits for no reason at all. And these companies, because they exist, because people are used to using them, and because they probably have better lawyers or just taking advantage of what people are used to, it's easier for local authorities to deal with them. And they have a lot more power than they should have in setting rates. I think the idea of starting up local cooperatives is really, really good. If you, I mean, obviously it takes coordination. You've got to have more than 1 or 2 people. But if you could do it, and if somebody took it seriously, that would be a really good way to go.
Fostering agency were very good, I have to say. While I was with them, I had a very good link worker who I was in constant touch with. We had good training, and I mean, I had been advised before I became a carer not to go with local authorities, which I totally agree. Seeing what I've seen since I was a foster carer and a kinship carer, the support for us as carers is not there within the local authorities, and it's not there for the children either.
Well, finds us in a hard place. Thanks very much, Jeanette. Again, I would just like to say thanks for doing what you do. I'm touched with everything that you said, actually. I'm going to invite Lynn Sheridan in first before Eva, because Lynn had something to come back on. I think it was on Alan's point, so I'll bring Lynn in.
Yeah, can I first of all apologise for coming in late. Just come from working with 22 primary school children in a group work project that I'm attached to currently through my job. I'm back to my inner child of drawing fairy dust and making pizzas and God knows what tonight. So the brain might be a bit mush. Just to say, in terms of the points that Alan was making, I mean, it's written into the legislation in Scotland that any companies that work with children, it's on a not-for-profit basis. So they're not allowed to make a profit. But what does happen is, and if you check some of these charities, where they're registered, they charge a number of them. What they do to get round that piece of legislation is that they actually charge huge amounts in administrative fees, because the charity itself is registered in England and or Wales. So that's one of the ways that they get round it. But just listening to what folk have said, I mean, I've worked in social work now for 25, 26 years, managed child protection teams, and what Jimmy was saying, I can wholeheartedly concur with, in terms of it's the worst decision that we can make. It's the hardest decision that is made, but it's sometimes the best situation in terms of removing a child. It's not always the best thing to leave them in a family. But a lot of the children that we work with certainly within local authorities, biggest issues in relation to poverty and or addiction issues, where the parents have addiction issues, and the other is in terms of domestic violence. And Maggie and Jane are absolutely right in terms of the victim blaming that goes on there, in terms of the mothers being, you can't protect yourself, so how are you going to protect your wains, that type of scenario. I think in terms of the poverty, and we're talking about solutions, then we could lift the whole layer of people out of poverty by introducing a universal income, and then looking at what are the other issues. And Maggie's absolutely right. We need to have solutions at a local level. So in Glasgow, what the Glasgow City Council are doing currently, they have the family decision-making projects, which brings together, they have a researcher who's based at the Mitchell Library. And what they do is they do a family tree, and they collate information on everybody, so aunties, grannies, whatever, because we know that in a lot of family circumstances, when the couple split up, then usually the paternal grandparents, for example, they don't get access to the kids. They don't get to see the kids at all, but they're all brought together and put in a family room and told to thrash it out, and who's best to come in and look after these children. And if that's not a possibility, then how best does the family stay in touch with the children? And it's working really, really well. So the point that Maggie made about incomes and resources to social workers, you can hardly get the OK for a senior social worker these days to buy a pen, never mind to put services in to work with families. And in terms of residential childcare, it's cheaper to send a child to Gordonston than it is to, we spend more in terms of children in care than what it would cost to send them to a private boarding school. And that's a ludicrous situation that we find ourselves in Scotland. The final point I would make is, I think a lot of this is class-based as well, because, and Maggie said it herself, if social work chapped her door, she'd shut the door in her face and go and get a lawyer. Well, the majority of working class or non-working parents in Scotland don't have the opportunity to do that, or are unable to afford that. And the family lawyers are very few and far between. And so for me, it's a class issue. If you're working class and you come into the sphere of social work, then you are in trouble. There's no doubt about that. And we can look at all of the different interventions that are there, but we need to get better at early intervention. The difficulty that we have, and again, it's a finance and resource issue, is that how do we measure early intervention? When I used to manage work down in Derbyshire, and we managed early start projects down there, Sure Start projects. And one of the measurements that was used was, one, they were given 7 years funding. A lot of the charities, a lot of the organisations like Gaze a Break and other groups that work with families in the community are constantly having to apply for grant funding. Every year, the managers are sitting, not planning what they're going to do and how they're going to work with the families, but filling in grant application forms. And I think that would be one of the ways that we could alleviate some of the pressure on these organisations, is to give them proper funding from day one, and to then look at what are realistic measurements in terms of outcomes of the work that they do. So I'll shut up there and let other people come in. Sorry, I'm on my high horse.
Just before I open up to the panel, Lynn, thanks very much for coming in and speaking. and also for channeling your inner child. Something that a lot of people should do a lot more often, if you ask me. And I'll come over to Gordon first this time to see if he's got a response to anything that Lynn said there.
No, to be honest, I don't really. It was interesting, but a wee bit outside my sphere, I think.
Okay, Jane.
Nothing else for me to add at the moment. Thanks
Nothing.
very much.
And Maggie.
Just a little bit about family group conferences or decision makings. Actually, that was one of the things that when I worked at Children First, we had introduced, and we most councils in Scotland, we were providing them at one time. But the big problem we found was not getting the decisions resourced, because, like, so who was it? Oh, Lynn said, you know, you can't get a pen, you know, there isn't. And I said that earlier, the budget needs to be down in the local areas, accessible to people, to get things like bunk beds and bedding, washing machines. When a washing machine breaks, it's a disaster in a family when you've got children. So, but the kinship carers become impoverished, really. So there needs to be proper resourcing of kinship care, rather than just seeing it as like, oh, it's all in the family, and we'll have like another woman, you know, approaching retirement, still having to face years of work and not getting properly, not having a proper income for that. Because if you could just pay the kinship carers a half of what it costs to pay the care companies, the money would stay in the areas where the children come from, and the money would be spent in those areas. So that's out there about family group decision making. It's not, it sounds good, it is good, but it's only good if it's resourced.
Thanks, Maggie. It looks as if we've lost Lynn's camera for the minute. So I'll leave Lynn at the back. Do you want to come back on anything that Maggie had said there, Lynn? Your mic's off as well.
You're muted, famous last words. I think in terms of what Maggie's saying about local resourcing and funding, probably Gordon being the accountant that he is and whatever. I mean, we talk about the reinvesting in local communities. Well, how better to reinvest than to have that money, you know, having either on the basis of care agencies or cooperatives or whatever. But, you know, the Jesuit priests used to say it takes a community to raise a child. And that's what we need to get back to. We need to get back to that holistic perspective. And looking at the whole solution and not just parts of the solution. And in order to do that, you know, somebody's put up in the chat about access to the CAM services. You know, I chair reviews for foster carers. And one of the biggest issues for carers is when they've got a child who has got some behavioural issues or problems. One I spoke to recently has been waiting over 2 years now for a CAMS appointment. Now that's just ludicrous, because the longer we leave things, the worse things are going to get for these kids in terms of their behaviour, in terms of their outcomes, in terms of education, etc., etc. We need to get better at being what we should be now, which is corporate parents. And as the report way back was written, it's everyone's job to make sure I'm all right. And no truer words have came from and that was from a child. It's everyone's job to make sure I'm all right. That's what that young person said. And that was the label for that report at the time. And it is everybody's job, because otherwise we'll continue to have the Kimberly McFarlanes, we'll continue to have the wee boys, say Bradford and others. And I think what the point that Jane was making earlier about the increase in numbers of children being looked after is probably a backlash in terms of some of these cases that are now coming to court, and that the social work managers are becoming less and less risk averse, and instead of it being the last resort, it's seen as the first resort of to remove children, and to justify that in terms of that being on the basis of their safety.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Thank you so much. I'm going to bring Eva Comrie in now. I'll just add you on here, and I'll remove one. So on you go, Eva.
Thank you, Peter. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, perfectly.
Thanks. I'm really very interested in what various people have said tonight about class-based relationships, because during the course of the pandemic lockdown, particularly in spring and summer 2020, what was painfully obvious to me and to several colleagues was a divide in terms of Scottish Government advice about family contact. And the divide was between the way that children who were in non-related foster care were treated and how children who had shared care with their parents or within the family were treated. And there was two sets of Scottish Government advice came out. One for family cases where there was no involvement of social work or the children's panel or the like, required that in effect mums and dads continued with the shared care arrangements that might have been in place pre-lockdown. So they were allowed to travel, and children were allowed to move from one home to the other. And in fact, that process was actively encouraged by the judges, even in the, the High Court, the Court of Session, who approved that, and they had their own guidance note written. So that was on the one hand what happened if you were a child not in care. But if you were a child in care, what I found in Clackmannanshire and in some other places that I'd heard about anecdotally was that in effect, on day one of lockdown, the shutters came down and all family time completely stopped. So I knew a lot of people locally who just didn't see their children at all for months on end. And what the social work service described as contact was actually an exchange of emails, perhaps some emailed photos. And for those who were really very fortunate, they would get a FaceTime or a Zoom call. Those parents didn't even get to participate in children's panels for the first few months of lockdown. What happened was that the person who runs the panel is called the reporter. So the reporter would set up a children's panel to happen by phone, and they were allowed to have, instead of the normal 3-member panels, during lockdown, they were allowed to have a panel that only had 2 members on it. Time limits for various things were extended, and in effect they were doubled. Safeguards to do with appeals and trying to get into court became very difficult to manage. But when these telephone panels occurred, the only people who participated in the phone panels were the reporter who managed it and the 2 panel members. They could get representations from the parent if the parent was lucky enough to have a lawyer who was able to email the reporter what the parent's position was. The reporter then read an excerpt of the email over the phone to the panel members, who then made their decision. The decision was then only intimated by the reporter to the lawyers or the parents several weeks later, because the reporters weren't in their office and didn't have access to all the usual admin facilities. So several weeks would go by before you knew what the decision of the panel about your child in care was. It was completely and utterly unacceptable. What happened thereafter was, as the process developed, panels began to be held by video link. And so some parents were very lucky that they had lawyers who got the panel papers emailed to them, but they were emailed in such a way that they could not be forwarded, nor could they be printed off. You had to download them and read them there and then the link disappeared. So that you had to have either the ability to read very quickly and write at the same time, or literally a photographic memory to tell your client what the reports said. So those children's panels that took place then were done by what's called VScene. But we then had the impact of poverty, and this is where I say the class-based thing is awful. To participate in a VScene panel hearing, you have to have a phone. You have to have access to the internet. You have to be able to have money in your phone. You have to have paid for your Wi-Fi. You have to afford the 4G. You have to have the facility in your phone to actually phone and email the reporter's office, give them your contact details, and get them to send you a link that you then download and follow to participate. So they did that by VScene for a while, and I went to innumerable panels that way where there were horrendous difficulties with connectivity and some parents weren't able to connect at all. They then changed the system. We went back for a wee while to face-to-face panels, and then we went on to panels that are now done by teams. But since March 2020, so basically 2 years, I've been to countless children's panels, and more often than not, the children have not been seen. Some children have not been seen at all in 2 years. Now, the Scottish Government wouldn't want to admit that because they'll say things are getting better. That's not the case at all. I struggle to think of an instance where in the past couple of years, panels have made decisions based on full information. I can't think of a panel I've been at in the last 2 years where even if everybody's been able to join at the beginning, they've all been able to be heard all the way through. There's always people get knocked off, something goes wrong, somebody has to repeat something, somebody wants to speak, they can't be heard. You can imagine. It is absolutely not the means by which we should be making long, far-reaching decisions about children's welfare. But as I think it was Maggie said, and Lynn said as well, there are so many parents that don't have access to legal advice. So over the course of lockdown, there will have been a lot of parents out there that suffered quite terribly by not having contact with their children. Their bonds with their children in care will have been eroded by not seeing them for a long period of time. There will have been decisions made about what happens in these children's futures that are based on a very horrendous experience for all concerned, which has probably made life far more difficult for the children and for the families than it might otherwise have been. So having said all of that, what I'm really interested to know from the panel is whether any of them know if the Scottish Government is actually going to do some research into the impact of lockdown and the impact of the pandemic on children in care and on the outcomes for these children in care. Because if I was in charge, I would have all of these children and all of their families being given immediate access to therapeutic assistance in the context of early appointments with the CAMS service for assessment and also for ongoing assistance, because I can barely, shudder to think what the impact on them would have been. So I don't know if Jane or Maggie knows this. Is any of that work going to be done? Is there any extra effort being put into recruitment and to make these services available at the time of need, as opposed to, as others have said, waiting for a period of 2 years before you get an initial assessment? Thanks.
I seen Jane shaking her head.
Actually, I'm absolutely horrified by what you've just said there, Eva, but in many ways I'm not surprised either. I don't know anything about that, and it actually worries me that since the forum came to an end and I've sort of stepped away from that, how quiet things have gone. And the only thing I really know about Children's Panel, going back to the time of the lockdown period that you mentioned, is one of my team in the confidential forum was actually a panel member, and I remember her saying that they were struggling so much to get panel members to recruit, new people to join children's panels. But I have got no knowledge of anything that Scottish Government are intending to do or thinking about doing or looking into, researching and gathering the evidence that you're talking about. Sorry.
Maggie?
Yeah, well, my sad and cynical experience is that having made the promise, they've moved on to other pastures, gender recognition or whatever it is. It's the flavour of whatever is going to dominate the news now, and dominate, that virtue claiming. But they have announced, or I heard that they've announced, this £500 million for a family welfare fund. I can't imagine that's a whole new 500 million. If there is, I hope that some of it is, going directly to family welfare, all of it. But they should, you're absolutely right, Eva, they should be looking at the consequences for children. Although it doesn't take a genius to work out what the consequences are. The issue is what we're going to do about it.
Gordon?
Yeah, obviously, I don't have any insight into what the Scottish Government are going to do, but I have to say that I'm not at all surprised at what Eva said, because it's not just in social services and children's panels. That is just this is just symptomatic of what has been happening in Britain generally and in Scotland as well for the last 20 years, maybe longer. Everything has been moved online because it's more convenient for the agencies and the government and the councils. And local services, I mean, even something like tax, when I started in tax, there were 3 tax offices in Aberdeen. If you had a problem with your tax, you could go in and you could talk to somebody who actually knew what they were talking about. Now, you can't do that. You can't do that anywhere. Everything has to be done online. And everything, it strikes me, is being done not just to save money. It's because it is more convenient for the councils, more convenient for the government, it's more convenient for the agencies to do it this way. And in a sense, to avoid having to deal with real people and make difficult decisions. So yeah, I mean, I'm just not surprised. It's just the way things are everywhere.
Right. Thank you very much, Gordon. Maggie, sorry, not Maggie. I'm reading your, I'm reading your message at the same time. We're pushing time now, folks, and I need to thank everybody for attending. Alan, you had a final question. Do you want to unmute it without a pin, and we'll see if we can get even one of the other panel members to answer.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with what everyone else is agree more with what most everyone else has been saying. But one part there was about the children's panel and people that are going on them. I've certainly seen in my area people that go on the children's panel and then move on to applying to be elected as a local councillor in the area, which then means they've got to come off the children's panel and then be refilled, that slot refilled. And I think if they're looking at something like that, they need to look at an area where if they've got aspirations of using that as a platform to get themselves into the council or in any political situations, that needs to be put in the bud straight away. Because we can't have people going on then coming off, and then if they don't get elected again, then putting their name back on again to try and get back on the children's panel. However, that's not my question. My question is around the social work element of it. I mean, I agree that last protocol that children should be taken off their parents is the last situation. That has to be a severe situation for it to be like that. I've worked with social workers in the past who have been absolutely brilliant. I've also worked with other social workers who haven't done anything. They've not been good. Some of them are at the end of their career and they couldn't give a damn in some certain cases, which is a shame because they've probably been really good social workers before. But in some circumstances, for me, I'm thinking along the lines of, what is the last line of do you take children off the parents or the mother or the father? Because I mean, now I also know that other children are in that situation, and the social works, maybe they're scared to go in and say, I'm taking this child out that home. But I do think that there is situations where children should be taken out of their homes. Not that I would love to see that happen. It's the children should always be with their families, but in some circumstances, as in my own situation, I had to take my son away because I wasn't wanting him around that. And thankfully, the courts have upheld most of all that. And because I've certainly seen social works go to my ex-partner's house where they're pre-organised to come up.
Thanks, Alan. Right, I'll come to Jane to see if she's got any comments to make on Alan's point there. And
yeah, I think I just want to say that from the people that we heard from at the forum when they spoke about the reasons they were taken into care, some of the decision making was absolutely ludicrous. And we couldn't make height nor hair of it. And actually, the whole process of trying to get access to their care records in the first place to see what had actually been documented about the decisions of why they were taken into care was just a nightmare. And that was, again, a recommendation we made about, having access to those records. We heard from someone who was one of 3 girls, and the 3 girls had been taken into care because the mother had died, and it was decided that it wasn't appropriate for a man to raise 3 daughters for no other reason. It was just gender bias. There was this judgment on his capacity as a father. So now, if it had been 3 sons he'd been left with, it would have been fine, but it was deemed inappropriate because it was 3 female children. So those girls were taken into an orphanage and spent their childhood there, and had very little contact with their father. So I think in terms of decision making about, and I think it all comes down to individual social workers' professional judgment. Decision making, I think, needs to be transparent and open and scrutinised. And one of the things we have always said from the forum, and certainly something that's echoed by other organisations like Who Cares Scotland, is there should be an independent advocate and on behalf of the children, and any decisions around taking children into care or separating children from their siblings should be scrutinised by an independent advocate. And all of the decision making needs to be explained to the children in a way that they can understand.
Thanks, Jane. Gordon, have you got any comment to make on that?
No.
No. Thank you. Eva, do you have any comment you'd like to make on that?
I think it's a very difficult job to be a social worker. I've known some very good ones, and I've known some who did their work at times rather badly. I suppose my experience is a bit jaded because there have been some local difficulties that I knew about. But I think that social workers in the main are like all other professionals. They start off with the best of intentions and the greatest of motives. And sometimes it's unfortunate, but the system grinds them down. And sometimes there develops a culture within individual local authorities that is less than helpful also. But I think that people need hope. Jane's right when she talks in terms of the need for transparency and, independent oversight. But in the real world, we're all human, we're all going to make mistakes. That's why the multi-agency system of child protection decision making is so very valuable and valued, because there is an element of independence and some proper debate and exchange of ideas. But the system is far from perfect. It probably needs a substantial overhaul, and implementation of the promise is taken so long to do that by the time that they get their initial recommendations implemented, there's probably going to be a need for another review and probably quite different actions taken, not least because the number of people affected is probably going to end up being a lot higher than originally anticipated. And services that ought to be in place now, such as CAMS, are not. So if somebody's on a waiting list for 2 years before they get assessed, their condition at the end of that 2 years is likely to be far worse than it was at the start. So you've got, I suppose, an endless cycle. So less than easy and a lot of work to do. Some great work being done, but improvement required most likely across the board in some areas.
Thanks, Eva. As I say, we're out of time for this evening. So I would like to say thanks to our panel members, Gordon Miller, Jane Laidlaw and Maggie Mellon, to all of our commenters. Thank you so much, the audience, for taking part. I just wanted to finish up with Jimmy Ross's comment when Eva was speaking about the situation that she spoke about. They said it was disgraceful. So just to pay attention to so that nobody's getting missed out here. So on behalf of Alba Equalities and the Alba Party, thank you very much for allowing me to host this event this evening. A special mention to Jeanette Baird for everything that she does, and especially continuing to do so in such a difficult situation. Thanks again to all of our panel, to all of our commenters, and from Alba Party Equalities, from Alba Party and the Alba Equalities team, on behalf of Tweet Street, Occupied Scotland, Circle Saltire, it's good night from us, and we hope you enjoyed the offerings.